As Alex just mentioned, I'm going to go through three things that I've been researching, or we've been researching at Brand Positive throughout the year. So hope, community and resilience. And those three issues came up and I think were very apparent very, very quickly back at the start of this year when, as the saying goes, C19 tore up the script and we really found ourselves put under, sort of obviously enormous societal pressure, to put it mildly. Now, from the point of view of hope, and let's start with that, I think this is effectively where many of us have felt that we were, or certainly are, and perhaps indeed are going. As they say about alchemy, I think the most sort of key thing about it, that is that hope is the alchemy that turns your life around, as the saying goes. And hope is the sort of thing that tends to crop up on every occasion when there is a major challenge facing us, either on a sort of personal level, on a societal level, or indeed at the moment on a global level. And certainly from the point of view of COVID tearing up the script, to quote Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum, there's something naturally that has been reflected heavily throughout the world this year on a cross-societal basis. And so what we've done there is to effectively interview a ton of interesting people, a ton of experts, read every relevant report going, and try and come out with some sort of take on this that is relevant to where we are now. Now, again, I just need to make it really clear here, in case I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to go into a very, very deep reading of this, but certainly from the point of view of the amount of time we have available this morning. So what I'll do is just go through a couple of the routes that I think are relevant. Again, I think for an audience as we have today, I've seen who's joining us today in various countries. We've got a very, very broad spectrum of people here today joining us. So hi to everyone. So what I'll talk about basically is the following things. So to me, I think what is really, really fascinating in terms of having a really great take on this, perhaps, is the book by Terry Eagleton. And Terry Eagleton wrote a fantastic title that was titled Hope Without Optimism. And his take on this, I think, is really, really interesting, whereby he, if you like, pulled apart the differences between hope and optimism, and in particular, authentic hope versus what he termed to be, if you say, banal optimism, from the point of view of it doesn't actually fulfill any function to merely be optimistic. Now, hope has to have has to be based on reason, and that basically and that reason has to be there to help us to go on versus the adversity we're facing. And so that issue of say hope without optimism, the issue that he pulled apart, whereby he would look at this from the point of view of, what is your hope based on? And this could be from everything from, say, a personal adversity to a societal one, to an issue around jobs, etc. Equal against a feeling of being hopeless, or indeed having entirely false hope. Guggle Postdoknes, a Norwegian psychologist, I think, had a really, really interesting view on this, and his 4 ways of looking at hope, I think, are absolutely fascinating. So what Postdoknes talked about was essentially 4 things. So he divided the first 2 into issues of optimism, and the second 2 into skepticism. So from the point of view of passive optimism, he looked at this from the point of view of people having a point of view which basically just says, it'll all be okay. A fairly vague point of view, essentially based on nothing but a feeling of optimism, which is nice to have, but is effectively not very, very useful. It's not really going to get you anywhere apart from making you hopefully feel just a bit better about you, as in it's not constructive. As opposed to an issue around, as he termed it, active optimism, which was keeping that sort of a positive viewpoint, but linking that to real effort. What he termed heroic hope. And this also links, let's say, into the world of business to things like innovation. And again, Terry Eagleton talked a lot about viewing hope as being an almost permanent state of, sort of revolution, should we say. The idea that it has to be constantly worked on and constantly fulfilled. a bit like, one could say, innovation that has to be something that is happening on a continual basis, that isn't just a one-off. And so that idea of people who are active optimists, who have, say, have a positive mindset, but actually do something, put in an effort to make what the aim it is that they have achievable, is a far more valid, and as he would put it, useful and constructive way to sort of base oneself. Where that has problems is, let's say, and this is certainly in regards to my last book, Influence the Revolutionaries, it was all about sort of, multi-sector innovation. One can look there at, one of the areas whereby people have been, let's say, looking at adversity in terms of the climate crisis, has been to say, okay, innovation will get us through. There are some super bright people out there that will invent something, that will create something, that will renew something, that will help us to deal with the appalling issues of the climate crisis. Where that has a inbuilt problem is when there is no genuine sense of that good result actually happening. This is why, for instance, one could say that the fantastic climate activists, Extinction Rebellion, may well have a real problem here if they are, if you like, basing the ethos of XR, and I've spoken to the obviously the sort of lead of XR about this, if they're basing their thinking on active optimism, because there are many who think that actually, innovation is not going to have the answer to this. Things will not just basically be sorted out. And so once you get into that situation, one can become very, very sort of despairing and despondent. So post-optimist then had two other versions that he looked at of hope. The first one was passive skepticism. And so passive skepticism is based around people who have perhaps a sort of a stoical point of view, a point of view that says, you know what, we'll weather the storm. We'll deal with this, we'll rebuild after it's happened. We may not be able to rebuild and get back to where we were, but we'll somehow struggle through. He then had a final one, which was active skepticism. And so that he talked about grounded hope. The idea of people being very realistic about the situation that's facing them, about the reality confronting them, but then saying, actually, you know what, let's just go for it anyway. So it's, being entirely aware about what's happening. It's not denying that, but it's saying, let's try and actually just get ahead through this. It's almost this, let's say, the wartime sergeant in the trench saying, we're surrounded, but let's just go for it anyway. One of us might get through. And so I think that sort of issue, talking about people like Extinction Rebellion, is perhaps far more relevant when they are realizing the horrendous ecological situation that confronts us, but at the same time as saying, well, we think that there may well not actually be an answer to this, but we've got to try anyway, because that's the ethical thing to do. That's the right thing to do. Okay. So in terms of what gives me hope, one could look, I think, to people like, let's say, like John Elkington, the fantastic green activist, and his latest book, Green Swans, talks about regenerative capitalism, which has a really, really interesting, dynamic, catalytic viewpoint on how we actually might get out of this mess from an ecological and climate point of view. And so therefore that is giving him, and hopefully us, for instance, hope with regards to things like, let's say, the Green New Deal. So on that, I want to say just a very, very quick flick through hope, say all based, I think, in terms of a couple of great thinkers, either in terms of dividing grounded hope based on reason from purely having an optimistic mindset that is very nice to have, glass half full versus glass half empty, but the reason bit being the vital thing. And then I say Per Stoknes, the Norwegian psychologist, he had a really interesting take on this, I say, dividing it into passive and active optimism, and then passive and active skepticism. Moving on from the point of view of, hold on, just making sure my slide's working here. From the point of view of community, we've all seen this, you've all seen this, as have I. One of the first, I think, global shared experiences that we had projected back to us and at us very early this year were all those images of people, singing on their verandas, if they were lucky to have one in Italy, those who were helping the local community, the idea of relinking or linking for the first time in a city perhaps with one's neighbours, the idea of giving help and receiving help, the idea of friendship groups becoming ever more valid and vital. A really interesting take on this to me came from someone I interviewed for my podcast, The New Abnormal, Stephen Hayward, who's head of cultural anthropology at Central St Martin's, and he talked about a viewpoint that was a shifting of the so-called Overton window, the centre of political debate. And he talked about, effectively the great shared experience, or a key shared experience of the last decade, has essentially been one that has been one of an obsession with the individual. So let's say in the world of marketing and advertising and branding in general, business in general, one whereby the customer was king or queen, the idea of mass personalization, and the idea, let's say, that you could curate your own reality. Essentially, let's say at the moment, with regards to the appalling Trump and the sort of forthcoming election, the idea one could curate one's own reality in so-called echo chambers, in terms of linking in with those who are purely sort of like-minded from the point of view of political viewpoints. What I think is absolutely fascinating that was fascinating from Stephen Hayward's point of view at St Martin's was the idea of that almost linking into a sort of Sartrean sense of existential freedom, which was, I can do whatever I like, I'm utterly free, all about the individual, and where that can lead us is, and this has been said many times, is into an area whereby empathy is in very, very short supply, because it's all about the individual. It's all about the individual, say, being sort of a king or queen of everything they survey, being utterly free. Unlike, let's say, the Iris Murdoch point of view, which was you had to have empathy built into that, otherwise that can lead you into very, very sort of dangerous ground. Where Stephen Hayward at St Martin's thought this was going, and this has been again reflected by a ton of the other very, very interesting sort of cultural watchers, social observers that I've interviewed, has been to say, okay, actually, well, where we are now is less, if you like, a sort of Sartre type world, and far more one that perhaps one could link to someone like Kant, who was all about autonomy. And I think one of the really fascinating things there was the Kant view, which was that we're living a sort of, again, a shared experience, so we have commonalities in experience, and that as long as we are taking control of our own viewpoints and our own actions, in terms of having a real choice there, then we can essentially do the same things as everyone else while remaining entirely individual. So we could all, for instance, in the shared experience of this year, stand on our doorsteps and cheer and clap for, let's say, the NHS, for the health workers around the world, depending where we are. So we can all do the same thing. And perhaps a year ago, the idea of us all doing exactly the same thing on a regular basis would have seemed to be very, very odd. And yet now that's entirely reasonable, and that links into, say, that Kant view of autonomy. It also links into that issue of, I think, in a branding sense, in a marketing sense. I know there are a lot of people joining us today from the world of branding in all of its forms. It also links into that idea of us having been responsible citizens this year, doing the right thing for each other, for society, and for ourselves. That idea of, say, responsible citizens also reflecting a need for responsible brands, responsible brand actions. And that issue about brand actions being far more important than mere advertising, becoming ever more important. So the idea that, in terms of reputation capital, that I've written about a lot, in terms of people judging brands and organizations of all types, from governments, say, through to sort of fashion brands and all the rest of it, judging them on the basis of, are they trustworthy, reliable, and competent? And we've seen plenty of organizations of brands this year stepping up to be counted, doing something relevant and right and useful, say, for the society, for the community around them. Those actions have been noted, they won't be forgotten. I think the idea of brand purpose, the dreaded world of brand purpose, which has been so overblown in many cases, has actually now really come home to roost. And we've actually seen, say, brands being judged by their behavior far more than merely by their communication. And also around the issue of, love thy neighbor, pay it forward. Again, events indeed like today, shared sort of knowledge amongst all of us, has been that real notion that we are stronger together. If there's, again, some common experiences and some common sort of viewpoints this year that have really stood the test of time, even just in the first sort of few months of the COVID nightmare, should we say, it is that idea that we are stronger together, and that is perhaps leading to an almost new social contract. The idea that pandemics erode capital in terms of finance. They also erode human capital in terms of the impact on jobs, which has been very, very apparent, tragically, for all of us, and we've all seen and noted this. But one of the positives of COVID, if one can put it like that, has been the idea that actually shared capital, social capital, has been strengthened. The idea that traditionally we've looked at things like faith groups and community groups and societies as being typical linking points in society that really bond society together. Those have been, I think, underlined, highlighted this year effectively as never before. So in terms of social capital, I think we are beginning to end this year in a far stronger way than when we started it. So it's one of those. Moving on to the next slide. So this is something I put up just in terms of resilience. Now, one can look at resilience obviously in many, many ways. I look at this initially through the issue of business, because again, there's so many people joining in this conversation today from an array of different business backgrounds. Something I think really, really fascinating there is the idea, as the economists put it, of businesses having to look ever more now at the idea of being agile, of being able to deal with shocks on a very, very swift basis, and actually putting into practice, as they would put it, anti-fragile tactics. And we've moved into a world whereby we're seeing the idea of sort of long-term brand strategy perhaps drifting away or being parked for the moment. What is far more relevant for business people throughout, in this instance, the world of marketing and all of its guises, is the idea of short-term tactical thinking and actions, getting them essentially to the end of the next quarter. And it's becoming far, far closer to home in terms of what brands need to be doing, how they need to be acting, how they need to be communicating to actually do something that is relevant and useful and meaningful for people, as opposed to, again, say, merely coming out with sort of, if we say, glib statements. So that idea of companies perhaps saying goodbye for the present time to to an ever greater focus on efficiency, which is essentially where most business thinking was taking us, and instead thinking about resilience, is, I think, a very, very interesting way that we're seeing sort of a business going. It's why I think we'll see those notions from, again, people like Klaus Schwab, who wrote the fantastic Great Reset earlier this year. That was hot off the press straight after COVID hit us. Klaus Schwab heading up, say, the World Economic Forum, and with the Great Reset, as I'm sure you all know, being the title of the 2021 meeting, the sort of Davos summit held online rather than on the ground. He'll talk a lot there about us having to build in resilience to where we are, and to think about where we take things, where we go next, by viewing COVID as a window of opportunity. So we've had, as he would put it, the time to the great pause. We've had time during the great pause to reflect and reconsider, to reimagine our world, the way we work, what we do, and effectively to reset the world. And it's an opportunity that we simply wouldn't have had if COVID hadn't come along. And so I think it's very interesting how he will look at the, he certainly won't deny the appalling reality, the huge numbers of deaths and the misery that COVID has brought, but says, okay, let's utterly accept that. We have to confront that reality, but also try and take some sort of positivity out of this to, as you said, to reflect and reset the world, along with great thinkers in a sort of in a marketing sense, like let's say Rita Clifton, I interviewed recently, who talks a lot about rehumanizing companies, the idea of savior brands, the idea of brands genuinely being there to help, the idea of genuinely being there to be constructive and useful, and play a really, really meaningful role in people's lives, perhaps a sort of role that, that essentially had been forgotten. So again, so they will all look at COVID, as they would put it, as a portal to a better future. So last slide. And what we'll talk about here is just to sort of sum this up. So the idea of, as mentioned, having been through what Klaus Schwab talked about, that idea of the pause, the time of reflection, the idea perhaps of mental refreshment, puts us in a position now whereby we have to try and find opportunity from adversity, and adversity is all around us. We know the impact on the economy is, and economies globally are appalling. Now, we also know obviously that that has shifted around. There are certain economies that are coming out of the COVID nightmare at speed. We know the Chinese economy has bounced back very, very quickly. We know the American economy and ours and many others are effectively on their knees, but hopefully sort of on our knees, looking to the stars, as they say. So that idea of rebuilding by design, not chance, taking this time to clearly think through what sort of world is it that we want to live in? What is it that we actually want to be doing with our lives? What opportunities do we genuinely have? What opportunities can we genuinely create? Again, going back to the point I made earlier on about the different types of hope, the different types of strategies that we can build in personally to taking different elements of hope and seeing which types work for us is, I think, incredibly important. So the idea of on a business sense, on a personal business sense, the idea that for some businesses, for some people, this is absolutely a time of sheer survival. For others, it's a time of adapting. For others, it's a time of completely refreshing what it is that one is doing and will do in the future, from the point of view of, in many cases, the old rules no longer applying. Because obviously we don't know where things are going. We could be moving to a more egalitarian world, or we could be moving to a more authoritarian one. And certainly the idea of different types of, let's say, democracy versus authoritarian governments have had very, very different reactions to COVID, and that has naturally had a huge impact on the societies that exist within those political frameworks. We could be moving to a time of more social solidarity, or it could be, of course, to a time of more individualization, where people are actually sort of ignoring community around them. But certainly I think what one could agree, no matter what political viewpoint one has or what system one is living under, is that we certainly need to reimagine where we are and what we're doing. But from my point of view, in terms of pinning this around, as I termed it earlier this year, the new abnormal, which suggests that no, everything won't change, but also no, we aren't at the other end of that polarity either. We'll be somewhere in the middle. Hope, community and resilience, to me, are absolutely the ways forward. And the key thing for each one of them, so that one cannot be hopefully accused of being banal about these points, is to say, first of all, work out what type of hope works for you and the experience that you are living. What areas of community action can one be either contributing to, hopefully, or linking up with? And from the point of view resilience, what behavioural changes or actions can one put into place to actually enable oneself to be more resilient and more agile to deal with both the current enormous shock and indeed future shocks? So as a very, very quick quick flick through. That's me. So as I say, hope, community and resilience, I do believe are the ways forward during and indeed hopefully after COVID. And I will now hand the control back to Alex and the team.